Every crime hides a story, and every story leaves a trace.
It was in the closing days of October, during a season of unusual fog and damp that clung to the very bones of London, that we received a most peculiar visitor at 221B Baker Street. I remember the hour well, for it was nearly 1 in the morning, and Holmes had just concluded a rather scathing critique of my recently published account concerning the adventure of the Whodunit tunnel, when the doorbell rang with an urgency that defied the hour. "Even at this hour," Holmes murmured, stretching languidly on the settee, "the world refuses to sleep." I rose to answer the bell, half expecting a confused drunk or an insomniac postman, but the figure that stood in the doorway was neither of those things. Tall, pale, and trembling beneath a soaked black cloak stood Lady Agatha Farringdon, a woman whose name carried weight in both society columns and philanthropic circles. "My apologies for the hour, Doctor." "Watson," she said with a voice both elegant and strained. "But I was told Mr. Holmes keeps unconventional hours." "He does," I replied, stepping aside to usher her in, "and you are quite fortunate that he is awake and alert. Come in, Lady Agatha." Holmes sat upright the moment her name was mentioned. "Lady Agatha Farringdon? Of Wiltham House, I presume?" "The same," she replied, "though I scarcely know whether I still dare call it home." Her words intrigued Holmes, and with a gracious wave of his hand, he gestured for her to take the armchair opposite the fireplace. "You are not here out of social obligation, Lady Agatha," he said. "The stiffness of your posture, the unnatural pallor of your face, and the traces of mud on the hem of your gown suggest haste, distress, and a journey made partly on foot. What has happened?" She paused, visibly collecting herself. "Mr. Holmes, something unnatural is occurring at Wiltham House. For the past 3 nights, precisely at midnight, the house has awakened." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Awakened, madam?" "Yes," she said, her voice trembling again. "Doors open of their own accord. The bell in the east wing rings, though no one has touched it in years. Footsteps echo through the library, and last night the harpsichord in the music room began to play a tune long forgotten, and yet no one is there. Not a soul." Holmes's eyes sparkled with interest. Watson, still skeptical, asked, "Have you considered that perhaps someone is attempting to frighten you?" "A servant, perhaps, or a trespasser." She shook her head. "The household consists only of myself, my maid Eliza, and Mr. Fenley, the groundskeeper, an old and loyal man who has served our family for decades. The rest of the staff was dismissed months ago due to financial constraints." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And what occurred tonight that compelled you to come here in person?" Lady Agatha's lips trembled before she spoke. "At exactly midnight, I awoke to find muddy footprints leading from the garden door into the drawing-room, footprints that matched none of our shoes. And then I heard my late husband's voice calling my name from the cellar." There was a heavy silence in the room. Holmes broke it with a quiet but firm, "You are not mad, Lady Agatha." "Of that I am quite sure. There is a rational explanation to be found, even behind the gravest phantoms. You say your husband is dead." 3 years this winter," she whispered. "He fell from the cliffs behind the estate. His body was found, shattered, but without question." "Was there an inquest?" "Yes. It was ruled accidental." Holmes stood. "We shall take the 9:15 train to Dorset in the morning. Watson, you will pack accordingly. I suspect the sea air will be quite bracing." I could only nod as my mind struggled to reconcile the rational world I inhabited with the strange events that now lay before us. Lady Agatha exhaled in quiet relief. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. If there is a ghost, I trust you will unmask it." Holmes offered a faint smile. "Whether it be ghost, man, or devil, we shall know the truth before long." And so began one of the strangest cases I ever had the fortune, or misfortune, to witness. The case of the house that woke at midnight. The morning broke grey and sullen. the kind of mourning that seemed reluctant to be borne at all. As our train cut through the damp countryside toward the southern coast of Dorset, I found myself watching Holmes more than the passing scenery. He had said little since our departure, retreating into a silence that I'd come to recognize as the womb of deduction, pregnant with thought and waiting only for facts to give it shape. His long, pale fingers tapped absently on the brim of his hat, while his sharp eyes, though half-lidded, missed nothing. I refrained from interrupting him, knowing well that he was already constructing the scaffolding of reason upon which he would later build a solution. It was nearly noon when we arrived at the modest station near the village of Nether-Durl-Stone. A low mist clung to the fields, and the scent of salt lingered in the air, a constant reminder that the sea was never far from these parts. Lady Agatha's carriage awaited us, driven by the aforementioned Mr. Fenley, a tall and leathery man whose lined face showed signs of both age and stubborn endurance. "Mr. Holmes?" he greeted with a deferential nod. "Dr. Watson. Her ladyship is most grateful for your coming." Holmes offered a courteous tilt of the head and climbed in without a word. I followed, and soon we were rolling down the gravel lane that curved through a wood thick with ash and oak, their black limbs glistening with the remnants of last night's rain. The first glimpse of Wiltham House was a striking one. Built of pale Dorset stone and crowned with twin gables, the house rose from the edge of a crag like a relic of a sterner age. Its windows were narrow, its chimneys tall, and, though the lawn was impeccably kept, a sense of loneliness clung to the place like ivy on old mortar. Lady Agatha met us at the steps, her composure restored, but her eyes still haunted. "You are most welcome," she said, leading us inside. "I had your rooms prepared." "I am grateful," Holmes replied. "But before we make ourselves too comfortable, I should like to see the drawing room, the place where the footprints ended, yes?" She nodded and led us through a series of stately but sparsely decorated corridors, until we reached a chamber adorned with faded tapestries and a stone fireplace that looked seldom used. "The prints began outside the garden door," she said, motioning toward the French windows that opened onto a gravel path beyond. "And they stopped here, abruptly, in the center of the room." Holmes knelt immediately, withdrawing his lens and examining the floorboards with close attention. "Watson, your eye, please," he said, and I joined him, noting several faint streaks of mud near the carpet's edge. "Observe the shape. Narrow heel, shallow tread, yet deep pressure at the ball of the foot. A man's print, but someone light, perhaps injured. See how the right foot is slightly dragged." I looked more closely. "Yes, there's an irregularity in the arc. You believe the man was lame?" "Possibly, or limping for effect." He turned to Lady Agatha. "Was anything taken from this room?" "Nothing," she replied, "but the bell in the east wing rang shortly after." "Where no one resides?" "No one has lived there since my husband's death. It was his study." Holmes rose. "Then that is where we shall go next." We passed through another corridor, one lined with portraits. Holmes paused before a particular one, a stern-looking man in naval uniform with a hawkish nose and pale eyes. "Your husband?" "Yes." Captain Ambrose Farringdon Holmes studied the portrait, then the brass plate beneath it. "Born 1837, died 1891. That would place his fall in midwinter." "Yes, December 12th. It was snowing." Holmes said nothing more, but I saw the quick flicker of thought behind his gaze. He filed away the detail with the precision of a surgeon. The east wing was colder, and the air seemed to hold a lingering scent of disuse. We passed into the study, an austere chamber with a wide oak desk, heavy bookcases, and a barometer mounted beside the window. The bell-pull hung loosely on the far wall. Holmes moved with careful economy, running his fingers along the inside of the window frame, lifting a corner of the rug, noting the scuff marks on the leg of the desk. "It has been disturbed recently," he said. "I haven't set foot in here in weeks." said Lady Agatha, genuinely puzzled. Holmes opened a drawer and withdrew a single sheet of paper. It bore a short line of handwriting in a dark blue ink. The price of silence is always paid in whispers. Holmes turned to Lady Agatha. "Does this mean anything to you?" She paled. "That was one of my husband's phrases. He used to say it about his time in service, some affair in India. I never knew the details." Holmes folded the paper and placed it into his coat pocket. "May I retain this?" "Of course." Holmes examined the bell pull and followed the cord up into the ceiling, then turned abruptly. "Come, Watson, the garden next." Outside, the fog had retreated slightly, and the outlines of the cliffs beyond the house became visible. Stark white cuts of rock leading down to the sea. Holmes moved to the garden door and examined the frame, then knelt on the gravel path. I followed, and we both observed the unmistakable impression of footprints that began in the grass beyond the hedge. "Odd," Holmes muttered. "See here, the prints do not lead to the house from the road, but from within the hedgerow itself. And note the broken twig above. Someone crawled through rather than use the main path." I was about to respond when a sound drew our attention, a distant, high-pitched chime, barely audible and coming from the direction of the cliffs. Holmes straightened. "That," he said, "is not a natural sound. Shall we investigate?" We followed the sound past the formal gardens and down a winding path that led to the rear bluff. There, perched at the edge like a sentinel, was a small stone structure, a watchtower perhaps, or a folly. Its windows were boarded, but one had been recently pried loose. Holmes stepped inside, and we found ourselves in a circular chamber with only one item of note, a rusted harpsichord, its keys yellowed and half-warped by the salt air. One of the strings was vibrating faintly. "Remarkable," Holmes said, running a gloved hand along the edge. "It was struck recently, no more than a few minutes ago." I looked around. But who? We saw no one. That, Watson, is precisely what makes it interesting. As we returned to the house, Holmes stopped beside a weathered stone marker at the bluff's edge. The inscription had been nearly eroded by wind and rain, but I made out a name. Ambrose Farringdon, 1837 to 1891. A grave, right at the spot where he had died. Holmes lingered only a moment before turning back toward the house. "The dead do not walk," he said under his breath, "but someone wishes us to think they do." He said no more that evening, but I could see in the tightness of his mouth and the gleam in his eye that the game had begun in earnest. That night at Wiltham House was steeped in a peculiar stillness, a deceptive calm that seemed to press down on the house like the weight of a held breath. Dinner was a quiet affair, attended only by Lady Agatha, Holmes, myself, and the ever-stoic Mr. Fenley, who served with mechanical precision and spoke not a word. Holmes scarcely touched his food, his thoughts clearly elsewhere, and Lady Agatha's hand trembled faintly each time she lifted her glass. After the meal, Holmes requested that we take coffee in the drawing-room, the very chamber where the footprints had last been seen. As the clock in the hallway struck 10, he stood and crossed to the French doors, inspecting the latch once more with deliberate care. Then he drew the curtains tightly and extinguished all but a single oil lamp, which cast long shadows across the wainscoting. "We shall wait here," he said simply. 2 hours yet till midnight." I nodded, settling into a chair with my revolver discreetly tucked into my coat, a precaution Holmes had suggested earlier with a single glance. He himself remained standing, gazing into the flickering lamplight, while Lady Agatha sat nearest the hearth, visibly composed, yet unable to mask the tension in her posture. The minutes passed slowly, measured by the low tick of the mantel clock. Somewhere down the corridor, a pipe creaked under the strain of old plumbing. The wind hissed faintly beyond the windows, and then, just as the clock began its final chiming of 12, we heard it. A bell, sharp and sudden, ringing once from the east wing. Lady Agatha stiffened, her eyes wide. Holmes motioned for silence, already moving. We followed him out into the corridor, where the chill seemed to deepen with each step. He paused before the door to the study, Captain Farrington's old domain, and held up a hand. Then, without a word, he turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was empty, the desk untouched, the rug unmoved. Yet something was different. Holmes moved immediately to the fireplace and reached up to the brass sconce fixed above the mantel. It tilted at his touch. "A mechanism," he murmured. "Watson, your lamp." I held it higher. Behind the sconce, now ajar, lay a narrow recess, and within it the unmistakable gleam of brass gears and coiled wire. "A clockwork trigger," Holmes said, almost admiringly. "Timed to strike the bell in this room at precise intervals. Cleverly set within the wall, a toy of an engineer, perhaps even a naval man with mechanical aptitude." "But who would set such a thing?" I asked. Holmes withdrew a small pair of tweezers and delicately extracted a sliver of black cloth that had caught on a nail within the recess. "We are being played upon," he said quietly, "by someone who knows the house, who has access to its secrets, and who wishes, above all, to suggest a haunting rather than a human hand." Lady Agatha stood in the doorway, pale but composed. "Then it is no spirit?" Holmes turned to her. "No, madam. It is a design, a masquerade, albeit a skillful one. And we must learn who would benefit from maintaining such a delusion." He gestured for me to follow, and returned down the corridor with purposeful steps. "We must speak again with Mr. Fenley." We found the groundskeeper in his modest quarters by the stables, seated before a small iron stove. He rose when we entered, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Fenley," Holmes said, "you have been in service to the Farringtons for how long?" 42 years, sir." "Then you knew Captain Ambrose well." Fenley hesitated, then nodded. "As well as any man knew him, I reckon. He was a hard one, disciplined, private." "Did he ever speak to you of enemies? Quarrels?" Fenley's brow furrowed. He had words with his brother once. "Mr. Julian. That was years back. Never saw him again after." "Julian Farrington?" I asked. "Left England altogether, I heard. Some scandal. The captain cut him out of the will." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Scandal. Debt and worse. He sold off land belonging to the estate without right. There was shouting, terrible shouting. Then silence. The captain never mentioned him again." "Do you recall the date?" "Autumn of 1889, just before the housekeeper left." Holmes was silent for a moment, then asked, "And since the captain's death, has anyone else, aside from you and Lady Agatha, entered that study?" Fenley looked uncomfortable. "No, sir. At least, no one I've seen." "But someone has," Holmes said calmly. "Someone who possesses an intimate knowledge of the house." Fenley clenched his jaw. "I'll double my rounds." "That may not be necessary. But thank you." We left the old man to his vigil and returned to the house. Holmes lingered in the front hall, his eyes tracing the joinery of the paneling and the baseboards. "Watson," he said finally, "what do we know?" "That someone wishes to suggest the supernatural, that the house itself is being manipulated by a hand that hides." "Precisely. And that the manipulation is clever, deliberate, and orchestrated with mechanical means. The harpsichord, the timed bell, the footsteps, all designed to unsettle. But to what end? To frighten Lady Agatha? Yes, but not merely for mischief. There must be a purpose." As we spoke, the front door rattled faintly in its frame. Holmes turned at once, crossing to the entrance and throwing it open. A man stood there, mid-30s, dressed in a rain-drenched traveling coat, his collar turned up and his eyes sharp despite the late hour. "I beg your pardon," he said, glancing between Holmes and myself. "I'm looking for Lady Farrington." "She is resting," Holmes replied coolly. "And you are?" The man hesitated. My name is Julian Farrington. Holmes stepped back just slightly. The captain's brother. Yes, I have returned from the continent on family business. I was told the house was still in my sister-in-law's hands. I hoped to speak with her about certain arrangements. Watson and I exchanged a glance. Holmes's expression remained impassive. You've chosen a peculiar hour. Julian smiled tightly. I prefer to travel by night. Less scrutiny. Holmes studied him. You must be tired. Do come in. I dare say we have much to discuss. As Julian stepped into the hall, I caught a glimpse of something peculiar beneath his coat. A smudge of dried mud on the inside of the cuff, the same shade as that we had seen near the garden door. Holmes saw it too, and for the first time that day, I saw a flicker of certainty in his eyes. The game was no longer merely afoot. It had stepped into the house. Julian Farrington accepted Holmes's invitation with a poise that bordered on defiance. Though soaked through and unshaven from travel, his voice carried the faint trace of breeding, an upper-class accent softened by years abroad and carefully measured. He removed his gloves with deliberate slowness, revealing long fingers that trembled only slightly from the cold. "Your sister-in-law is asleep, you said?" he asked, as Holmes helped him out of his coat and passed it to me, without taking his eyes off the man. I noticed Holmes did not hang the garment, but instead folded it loosely over his arm. "Yes," Holmes replied, "but I imagine she will be most surprised to learn you are in England again. When did you last speak?" "Not since Ambrose's funeral." Julian's tone was even. "We were never close, and after his death, Lady Agatha made it clear that contact was unwelcome." "And what brings you back now?" Julian hesitated, then offered a wan smile. "My reasons are partly sentimental, partly practical. I heard that the estate was deteriorating. I thought perhaps I could offer assistance if my presence was tolerable." Holmes nodded slowly. "Indeed, a generous impulse, especially given the unpleasant history." "History fades," Julian said with a shrug, though there was something forced in his tone. "I've made peace with my mistakes." Holmes said nothing to that. Instead, he gestured toward the sitting room. "Come, we'll get you warm. Dr. Watson, some brandy, if you please." I moved to the sideboard, pouring the drink with a slow, careful hand, as Holmes settled into a chair across from our guest. "Were you aware," Holmes asked, "that the house has developed certain nocturnal habits?" Julian looked at him blankly. "Nocturnal?" "Footsteps in empty corridors, bells ringing of their own accord, harpsichords playing from sealed towers." For a flicker of a moment, less than a blink, Julian's composure faltered. "That sounds like nonsense." "Doesn't it?" Holmes agreed pleasantly, handing him the brandy. "And yet these things occurred. Repeatedly. Last night, for example, muddy footprints were found in the drawing room, just after midnight. Strange." Julian took a long sip, but surely not unexplainable. "Indeed not," said Holmes. "Everything has an explanation. The question is whether the facts choose to reveal it." Julian smiled faintly, then looked into the fire. "You are Sherlock Holmes, aren't you? I didn't recognize you at first. I've read of your exploits." Holmes inclined his head. "And I of yours." Julian's eyes shifted back. "Then you know I was never convicted of anything." "I said nothing of conviction," Holmes replied mildly. "But theft, impropriety, vanished funds, these are public matters. I was young, foolish. Ambrose never forgave me." "No," said Holmes, "but he did change his will." That struck a nerve. Julian's jaw tightened. Holmes rose and walked to the window, lifting the curtain with one hand and glancing into the moonlit garden. "Tell me, where are you staying?" "In the village, at the White Hart Inn." "Forgive me," Holmes said, "but it's nearly 1 in the morning. You arrived on foot?" "I did." "In this weather?" "I like the rain." Holmes let the curtain fall, So it would seem. I saw then, with sudden clarity, that Holmes was leading Julia not through interrogation, but through carefully applied pressure, testing the man's story for hairline cracks. Holmes moved to the folded coat on the sideboard and with a swift motion turned the cuff outward. "Curious," he remarked, showing Julian the faint crust of blackish earth. "This mud, identical to that found near the garden door." Julian's voice turned cool. "You're suggesting I entered the house uninvited?" "I suggest nothing, Mr. Farrington. I observe, I infer. You have been here before tonight." "I have not," Julian said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then how?" Holmes asked softly. "Did the harpsichord play at midnight?" Julian stood suddenly, brandy forgotten. "I came here in good faith." "As did the footprints," Holmes interrupted. "Tell me, do you recall a phrase? 'The price of silence is always paid in whispers'?" Julian's lips parted, then closed. Holmes nodded. "A curious coincidence. We found that phrase in Captain Farrington's study. In his own hand, perhaps, or forged, but certainly planted there recently." Julian said nothing. His hands were clenched at his sides. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, would you kindly summon Lady Agatha? I think the time has come to place some truths upon the table." Lady Agatha entered 10 minutes later, wrapped in a dressing gown, her expression veiled but alert. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Julian. "I thought it was a dream," she whispered. Julian bowed stiffly. "Agatha, why are you here?" "I came to help." Holmes stepped between them, his tone now brisk. "Lady Agatha, you mentioned that your husband fell from the cliffs 3 years ago. I ask now, was it truly an accident?" She looked stunned. "What are you saying?" "I'm asking," Holmes said carefully, "whether he jumped or whether he was pushed." There was silence in the room. The fire hissed faintly behind the grate. "I don't know," Lady Agatha said finally. "He had been disturbed for weeks before. Brooding, he kept to his study, spoke little. Then one morning he left the house and never returned." "Did he leave a note?" She nodded. "Yes. It said only, 'The sea remembers.' I never understood it." Holmes turned to Julian. "And where were you that day?" "I was already abroad." "No," Holmes said. "You left 2 days later. I spoke with a clerk from the Dover steamer office. Your name is recorded on the 27th. The captain died on the 25th. Julian's shoulders slumped slightly. Holmes advanced. "You returned here recently. You know the house, the secrets, the bell mechanism, the hidden passage from the study to the old tower. You used them to manufacture hauntings." "Why?" Julian looked to Lady Agatha, then back to Holmes. "I wanted her to flee, to sell. The estate's value would have fallen under the pressure of its reputation. I could have bought it cheaply, restored it, taken what was denied to me." "And the voice in the cellar?" I asked. "A phonograph," Julian said bitterly. "Old recordings of my brother, left in the tower from his dictation journals. I merely arranged the rest." Lady Agatha stared at him, face pale as chalk. "You wanted the house? You terrified me, made me doubt my own mind. For this?" Julian's face twisted. "I deserved this house. I was born here. Ambrose stole everything, and you let him." Holmes moved toward the bell cord. "And yet you outsmarted yourself. You left too many pieces showing. Mud, prints, machinery, all relics of the living, not the dead." Julian sat heavily in the chair as if the energy had left him. "What will you do?" he asked. "That is not for me to say," Holmes replied. "Lady Agatha must decide whether to bring charges or bury this affair like so many others." She said nothing for a long moment. Then she turned away and said, in a voice colder than I had heard from her before, "No, you may leave in the morning and never return." Julian said nothing. He did not protest. He simply stared into the fire, as though hoping the flames might consume what little was left of his pride. As Holmes and I returned to our rooms, I could not help but ask, "You knew it was him from the moment he arrived?" Holmes smiled faintly. "From the moment he said he liked the rain." "And the rest?" "Elementary, Watson. Only a brother would know the captain's private phrases, the tower's secrets, and possess the motive of inheritance. The ghost, in this case, was no more than a greedy man in disguise." Outside, the wind howled softly against the glass. The house was silent, and this time it stayed asleep. The following morning brought with it a sky of pale gold and distant gull cries, as if the land itself was attempting to shrug off the residue of unease that had settled over Wiltham House. Holmes was already dressed and standing at the eastern window when I rose, his silhouette stark against the thinning mist that still clung to the ground, like the last breath of some lingering phantom. "There is something unsatisfactory in all this," he murmured without turning. I blinked away sleep. "You mean Julian's confession? Surely it explains the disturbances." "On the surface, yes," Holmes replied. "But the surface, Watson, is a mirror, capable of both reflection and deception. Consider, he returns suddenly, admits to engineering a sequence of eerie tricks to frighten his sister-in-law. He confesses under pressure. But the harpsichord, why choose an instrument sequestered in a decaying tower, one known to only a few? And what of the phrase, 'The price of silence is always paid in whispers'? Too poetic for coincidence. No, I believe we've uncovered the curtain, but not yet the puppet master." I knew that tone. It meant we were far from finished. Downstairs, Lady Agatha was breakfasting alone. She greeted us with a wan smile, but her eyes had darkened, not from fear, but something like betrayal wrapped in steel. She had slept, she said, though not well. The house had remained silent through the night, but she confessed a persistent sense of something unfinished, as though a door had been closed only halfway. Holmes wasted no time. After a brief exchange, he asked, "Your husband, did he keep any ledgers, diaries, letters?" She hesitated. "There was a journal he kept during his final year, locked in his desk. After his death, I stored it in the strong box in the cellar. I couldn't bear to read it." "I must see it," Holmes said at once. She agreed, and we descended into the cold depths of the house, lantern in hand. The cellar was dry and neatly kept, shelved with wines and tools, but largely empty. Near the back wall stood a heavy iron chest. She knelt, withdrew a ring of keys from her robe, and after a brief struggle with the lock, opened it. Inside lay the journal. Holmes took it carefully, handling it like a relic. He flipped through its pages, scanning entries written in a firm, precise hand. Occasionally, he paused to read a line aloud. "The wind speaks when it should not. JF persists with inquiries. He grows bold again. If I should fall, let the sea decide what is lost." Holmes closed the book. This confirms it. Julian was not simply estranged. He was under suspicion. But suspicion of what? "Ambrose never told me," Lady Agatha whispered. "He became reclusive, distrustful. I feared it was the war still echoing in him." "Perhaps," Holmes said, slipping the journal into his coat. "But I believe there is more here, something your husband guarded fiercely. May I inspect the study once more?" We returned to the east wing. The air here still felt heavier, as if stained by memory. Holmes moved with renewed energy, circling the room, tapping at panels, examining corners, finally halting by the bookcase beside the fireplace. With a grunt of satisfaction, he ran his fingers along the underside of the shelf and pressed inward. With a dull click, the central shelf pushed back and slid to one side, revealing a shallow cavity behind the books. Inside was a small wooden box, its lid carved with a naval crest and initials. A.F. Holmes opened it and removed a series of folded documents. Some faded, others crisp. He turned to me, eyes lit with sudden understanding. "Naval maps," I said, peering over his shoulder. "Not just maps," he replied. "Smuggling routes, notes in cipher, and here, a personal letter addressed to Ambrose." He read it aloud. "The cargo will arrive by nightfall. No Coast Guard must know. You are responsible for ensuring discretion. Payment upon delivery. The consequences of betrayal will reach further than sea or stone." "Ah." Holmes folded the paper. "There it is. Not merely disgrace, but complicity. Your husband was blackmailed. Or worse, he was involved in something illicit, something tied to these coastal cliffs." Lady Agatha leaned against the desk, stunned. "Then Julian, he knew." "I believe he suspected. Perhaps he threatened exposure, which would explain the ferocity of their quarrel. But Julian was no mastermind. He may have leveraged secrets, but he didn't orchestrate your husband's death. That came from deeper waters." Holmes turned to the window, staring out toward the sea. "There is still one element unresolved. Fenley." "The groundskeeper?" I asked. "Yes. 42 years of loyal service, but conveniently silent about these secrets. Either he turned a blind eye, or he saw something he chose not to share." Holmes crossed the hall and summoned one of the maids, sending her to fetch Mr. Fenley at once. When the man arrived, his lined face was stern, unreadable. Holmes wasted no time. "Mr. Fenley, were you aware of the smuggling operation Captain Farrington was involved in?" The old man stiffened. "No, sir." "Think carefully. You saw him receive strange parcels, leave late at night." A flicker of something passed across Fenley's face. "He walked alone on the cliffs sometimes, at odd hours. I never followed." "Because you were told not to." Fenley met Holmes's gaze. "Because it wasn't my place. He was a proud man, and he paid well to keep the peace." Holmes nodded. "Did you know about the documents hidden in the study?" "No." "Did you know of anyone else who might have?" A long pause. Then, "There was a man who came once. During a storm. He didn't give his name. Captain called him Ramsay." They argued, loud, and then he left. "When was this?" "A week before the captain died." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, do you recall the signature on that letter?" "Ah." "Ramsay," Holmes said. "A smuggler, no doubt. Possibly a former associate. Perhaps the captain tried to cut ties." "Would Ramsay have killed him?" "Unlikely. But he may have threatened to." Holmes began to pace. "What if the captain, fearing exposure or retaliation, staged his own death?" I stared at him. "Holmes, his body was recovered." "Yes, but shattered, mutilated, beyond identification by Lady Agatha, confirmed only by Fenley and a local constable. Suppose the body wasn't Ambrose at all." "You think he escaped?" "I think he tried to, but someone found him before he could disappear. Someone who knew the secrets, someone still here." Just then, a soft knock at the door drew our attention. One of the maids entered, pale and breathless. "Beg pardon, sir. There's a man in the village asking for Dr. Watson. Says he served under Captain Farrington. Holmes's head snapped up." "Name?" "Didn't give one, but he says it's urgent." Holmes turned to me. "Go. I shall follow shortly. This may be our missing piece." As I retrieved my coat and set out for the village, the chill returned, not of the sea wind, but of something else, something that had watched and waited ever since midnight fell over Wiltham House. And now I sensed it was preparing to speak. The path into the village was narrow and overgrown, still glistening with the dew of morning, and though I walked briskly, the weight of unease pressed on me more heavily with each step. The message brought by the maid echoed in my thoughts. A man asking for Doctor Watson, claiming to have served under Captain Farrington. That he had not approached the house directly, but waited in the village, spoke volumes. Such discretion hinted at fear or guilt. When I reached the main square of Nether Durrell Stone, The fog had lifted enough to reveal the crooked line of cottages and the faint bustle of morning life. The innkeeper at the White Hart gestured toward the back, where I found a man seated beneath a vine-draped trellis, his back to the low sun. He rose as I approached, tall, wiry, with a weather-beaten face and a sailor's bearing. One eye was milky white with cataract, but the other was piercingly clear. "Dr. Watson?" he asked in a voice roughened by years at sea. "I am." "And you are?" "Name's Ely Braithwaite," he said, shaking my hand with surprising strength. "Bosun, HMS Clarion, back when Farringdon had her." "You served under the captain?" "Aye, and afterward, though it weren't official." I gestured to a nearby bench and sat beside him. "What do you mean by that?" Braithwaite looked around, lowered his voice. "After the Clarion was decommissioned, the captain came back to Dorset. I followed. He said there was work. Quiet, profitable. Nothing that'd draw attention. Smuggling." The old sailor gave a wry smile. "Call it what you like. I ran a cutter through the night with parcels from the Channel. No questions, no names, but I saw what came ashore. Rifles, medicines, coins from the Indies. Contraband, then. Some of it. Not all." He looked at me gravely. "But the captain, he changed, grew colder, said someone was watching. He spoke of Ramsay, a man he'd once trusted, now turned. Said Ramsay wanted to run everything, told me if he didn't show up for a rendezvous in December of '91, I should assume he'd gone. Or worse. And did he?" Braithwaite nodded. "He missed the meeting. I came ashore and heard the news. Captain dead, body found at the foot of the cliffs. I wanted to speak up, but there were questions I didn't want asked." "You believe he was murdered?" "I know it. That body they found, wrong height, wrong boots. I saw the captain every week for a year. That corpse wasn't him, but I kept quiet. For the sake of my neck." A cold certainty began to settle in my gut. "Why now?" He hesitated. "Because last week I saw someone I'd not seen in years. Ramsay. He was in the pub at Wareham. Same scar on his cheek, same gold tooth, and he was asking after Wiltham House." I stood. Holmes must hear this. Braithwaite placed a hand on my arm. "He'll want more than words. Come with me. There's something I've kept, something the captain left me, in case this day came." I followed him across the square, down a sloping lane to a weathered cottage near the cliff edge. Inside, he rummaged through a trunk and withdrew a leather pouch. From it, he produced a folded oilskin and unwrapped it to reveal a letter marked with Farringdon's hand. "Braithwaite, if Ramsay returns, tell Holmes the cipher is in the painting. He'll understand. Do not trust the constable. They bought him too." My mind reeled. Holmes had been right. The captain had foreseen betrayal, had perhaps even staged his death to evade it. "The painting?" I asked. "Captain's portrait," Braithwaite said. "The one in the East Wing." I gripped the letter and thanked him, promising swift return. By the time I arrived back at Wiltham House, the sun was cresting higher, and Holmes met me halfway down the gravel path, coat flaring behind him. "You're late," he said, though his voice was more relieved than irritated. "Holmes, we've been looking in the wrong direction. Listen." I recounted Braithwaite's tale swiftly, and Holmes's expression sharpened with every detail. When I produced the letter, he took it reverently, reading it twice before nodding. "Of course," he murmured. "The cipher. Hidden in the one place no one would question, his own likeness." Together, we hurried back to the study. The portrait of Captain Farringdon loomed as before, hawkish, proud, staring into a distance none of us could see. Holmes stepped up, examining the frame closely. "Watson, bring me that lamp." He tilted the painting forward and ran his fingers along the rear canvas. A soft, crinkling sound issued from behind the lining. "Here." With a scalpel from his case, Holmes made a precise incision along the edge and withdrew a thin sheet of vellum. Strange symbols and numbers marched across it in meticulous rows. A substitution cipher, Holmes whispered. Old, naval code, likely. He didn't trust simple locks, he trusted minds. He worked for 20 minutes, decoding line after line, muttering under his breath. I recognized some of the phrases. South Bay Inlet, nightly landings, shore gate open only under the double moon, watchman bribed, and then, at last, Holmes drew in a sharp breath. Here, Ramsay turns upon the house. I write this with the certainty that he will come. If I do not destroy him, he will return when the secrets rot into soil. My death may buy silence, but not safety. Then Ramsay, he's still hunting the estate, I said. Looking for what? Perhaps something never delivered, or a record. Or perhaps vengeance. A shout from outside interrupted us, urgent and ragged. We ran to the entrance hall. Fenley stood there, face ashen. There's a man, he gasped, in the west orchard. Said he wanted to speak to you, but he's armed. Holmes turned to me. Braithwaite said Ramsay was back. It appears he has arrived. We stepped into the orchard moments later, beneath the knotted limbs of pear trees, their blossoms trembling in the breeze. A figure emerged from the tree line, a thick-set man in a seaman's coat, scar slashing one cheek, a pistol gleaming at his side. Holmes raised a hand. Mr. Ramsay, I presume. The man grinned without mirth. Took you long enough. You've come for what? Holmes asked coolly. The ledgers, the maps, or to finish what you started with Captain Farrington? He started it, Ramsay growled. He got greedy, thought he could outplay me, but he was wrong. I gave him a choice. He chose a cliff. So you did kill him, I said. I threw a man off a ledge. Whether it was Ambrose or a poor fool made to look like him, I didn't check the teeth. Holmes stepped forward. And now? I want what's mine. He kept records. I know it. Said it was insurance. Where are they? Holmes's voice was ice. Burned. Just this morning. You're too late. Ramsay's face twisted, and he raised the pistol. But at that moment, a sharp crack rang out. Fenley, hidden behind a hedge, had fired from a dueling pistol he'd taken from the house. Ramsay staggered, weapon falling, blood blooming beneath his collar. Holmes and I rushed to him as he collapsed into the grass. Tell Farrington, he rasped. He played it well. His eyes dulled. We stood in silence for a long moment. Finally, Holmes turned to me. The ghost of Wiltham House, he said, was a man with debts, secrets, and a memory too long for peace. We returned to the house, where Lady Agatha waited at the window, watching the fog begin to return. Returning to Wiltham House, the atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. The heavy burden that seemed to weigh upon its ancient timbers appeared at last to be lifting. Yet, despite the capture of Ramsay and the unearthing of long-buried secrets, a subtle unease lingered, like the final note of a dirge fading into the night. Holmes's keen gaze swept the drawing room as we entered, observing not only the physical space but the intangible aura that had pervaded it since our arrival. Lady Agatha greeted us quietly, her expression somber but composed. "Is it truly over?" she asked, voice tentative. Holmes nodded, removing his coat and setting the faded journal on the mantelpiece. "The shadow has been dispelled, Lady Agatha. Ramsay's grasp has been broken. The spectres that haunted these halls were never spirits at all, but men with mortal motives and deadly intent." I could see relief flicker in her eyes, mingled with sorrow for the tragedies endured and the wounds left open. And the captain? Was he truly the victim? Holmes hesitated. "Not merely a victim, madam, but a man caught in a web of his own making, caught between duty, honor, and the insidious demands of men like Ramsay." He turned to me, a faraway look in his eyes. "Watson, the investigation has revealed much about human nature. Greed, loyalty, desperation, Yet one aspect troubles me still. I raised an eyebrow. And that is? Holmes paced the length of the room, fingers steepled before his mouth. Fenley, the groundskeeper. His loyalty was unquestioned, but his silence was too steadfast. He knew more than he admitted. Lady Agatha frowned. He has served our family faithfully. Precisely, and such faithfulness can mask deeper conflicts. Holmes stopped abruptly. Watson, do you recall the note found in the study, the phrase, "The price of silence is always paid in whispers"? I nodded. That phrase came from Captain Farrington himself, a cautionary motto learned in faraway lands. It was a warning to those who keep secrets, especially deadly ones. Holmes fixed me with a piercing gaze. Fenley knew what was happening. I suspect he aided the concealment, perhaps not willingly, but out of fear or devotion. Before I could respond, a soft knock interrupted the conversation. The maid entered, bearing a sealed envelope. Lady Agatha took it, breaking the wax and unfolding the letter within. "It's from Fenley," she said, voice trembling. "He has resigned. He will leave at dawn." Holmes studied the letter carefully. He writes that he cannot live with the silence anymore, that the ghosts of the past weigh heavily on his conscience. There was a long silence before Lady Agatha spoke again. It seems even the most steadfast are haunted by truth. Holmes nodded gravely. Indeed. And now, with Ramsay gone and Fenley departing, this house may finally rest. He turned to me with a faint smile. But rest is relative, my dear Watson. The mind is a restless thing, ever drawn to mysteries as the sea is to the shore. I smiled in return, grateful for his unwavering spirit. That evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon and the last light faded from the cliffs, I stood with Holmes on the veranda, gazing out at the vast expanse of the sea. The house will sleep now, I mused, and the midnight bells will be silent. Holmes smiled softly. Until the next case calls us forth? We stood in companionable silence, two men bound by curiosity and the pursuit of truth, while Wiltham House settled quietly into the embrace of night. No longer a place of fear, but a monument to the resilience of reason over superstition. The case of the house that woke at midnight was closed, but the echoes of its story would linger, a testament to the complexity of human nature and the enduring power of deduction. As I retired to my chamber, I could not help but reflect on the intricate dance of deception and revelation we had witnessed, a reminder that in the shadowed corners of life, the light of truth, though sometimes faint, always finds a way to shine. The stillness of the night at Wiltham House was deceptive, for even as the household settled into what seemed a peaceful lull, the mind of Sherlock Holmes remained a whirlpool of restless thoughts. It was late when I finally found him seated at the study desk, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across his sharply etched features. His eyes, though weary, shone with an intensity that bespoke a mind still unraveling threads unseen by others. "Watson," he said without looking up, "there remains a certain matter that has escaped our notice, a detail that lies hidden not in what was done, but in what was left undone." I leaned forward. "What might that be, Holmes?" He tapped the letter from Fenley, the resignation note, against the wood. Fenley's departure weighs heavily on my conscience. His silence, his obedience, was not mere loyalty. It was fear. Yet what threatens a man of his age and experience so deeply? That is the question. I considered the groundskeeper's long tenure, his tacit knowledge, and the bonds he must have had with the late captain. "You suspect someone coerced Fenley?" "More than that," Holmes replied softly. "I suspect Fenley carried a secret, a burden that was not his alone to bear, something that compelled him to protect the house at all costs, even from the truth itself." The door creaked open, and Lady Agatha entered quietly, her face drawn but determined. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I have found something in my husband's belongings." Something you may wish to see." Holmes rose immediately, motioning for her to continue. She produced a small, worn journal bound in cracked leather. It was hidden beneath the false bottom of his writing desk drawer. Holmes took the journal reverently and began to read, the faintest trace of a smile crossing his lips. "Ah, this is illuminating indeed. Captain Farringdon was a man of many talents, but also of great caution." He flipped to an entry dated a month before the captain's death. "I have made a grievous error in trust. Ramsay is more dangerous than I feared. I have secured a message with a cipher, hidden within the walls of Wiltham House itself. If I fall, it must be found and understood. Only Holmes can unravel these layers." He looked up sharply. "Fenley was the key, Watson. He knew of this message and guarded it silently." "Then the cipher remains," I said eagerly. Holmes nodded. "Yes, and I intend to find it." We followed Lady Agatha through the dim corridors to the east wing once more, this time to the wall opposite the study's fireplace. Holmes began to examine the stonework closely, tapping and listening for hollow notes. His fingers traced the edges of a particular slab, nearly indistinguishable from the rest. "Here," he said finally, pushing against the stone. To our surprise, it shifted inward slightly, revealing a narrow cavity within the wall. Inside lay a small iron box, aged and rusted. Holmes lifted it carefully, pried it open, and withdrew a folded parchment covered in a complex script interwoven with nautical symbols. "This, Watson, is the final piece, the captain's true legacy." He spread the parchment on the desk and began decoding with remarkable speed, explaining as he went. "The cipher is a maritime signal code combined with a polyalphabetic cipher, a method designed to conceal smuggling routes and secret meetings." Minutes passed, then Holmes read aloud a message. "Trust no one beyond the loyal. The constable is compromised. Fenley watches but cannot speak. Seek the hidden ledger behind the third panel in the library. Time is short." Lady Agatha gasped softly. "The constable?" Holmes nodded grimly. "A man we had presumed trustworthy is likely involved in the deceit. This changes everything." We hurried to the library, a large room filled with heavy tomes and dust-laden shelves. Holmes counted the panels along the far wall and pressed the third one carefully. It swung open to reveal a small recess containing an ancient ledger bound in worn leather. Holmes examined it, eyes scanning page after page of coded entries detailing clandestine shipments, names, dates, and sums. Proof of a smuggling ring that had operated for years under the nose of local law enforcement. "There," Holmes said quietly. "This is the truth Fenley sought to protect. It implicates men beyond the household, men with power and influence." I could see the weight of the discovery settle on Lady Agatha's shoulders. "And now, what becomes of the house and those who have wronged it?" Holmes looked from the ledger to the shadows gathering in the corners of the room. "We bring the truth into the light, madam. But we proceed with care." At that moment, a sudden noise echoed from the hallway, heavy footsteps approaching swiftly. Holmes moved toward the door, eyes narrowed. The door burst open, and a man in a constable's uniform strode in, face flushed with exertion and something darker, urgency mixed with something unreadable. "I'm here to arrest you, Mr. Holmes," he said, voice harsh, "on charges of trespassing and obstruction." Holmes's gaze was icy. "And by whose authority?" The constable hesitated, then produced a warrant, but his hands trembled. Before Holmes could reply, the house's front door crashed open behind the man, and Fenley appeared, wielding a heavy iron poker. "You'll not touch them," Fenley growled. "The truth must be known." The constable glared, but faltered under Fenley's steady gaze. Holmes raised a hand. "Watson, it seems the final act has begun." The room held its breath as friend and foe stood locked in silent opposition. The fate of Wiltham House balanced precariously between justice and corruption. And in that moment, I knew the night held one last secret waiting to be revealed. The tension in the library was palpable, thickening the very air as Holmes, Fenley, and the constable regarded one another across the space filled with ancient books and whispered secrets. The constable's hand hovered near his belt, fingers twitching as if uncertain whether to draw a weapon or retreat. Fenley's poker gleamed ominously in the dim light, his weathered face resolute, embodying the last bastion of loyalty to a house shadowed by decades of deception. Holmes stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Constable Merrick, you are well aware that the charges you bring are grave, and the evidence required to uphold them must be beyond reproach. Pray, enlighten us as to the grounds for this sudden accusation." Merrick swallowed hard, the bravado draining from his eyes under Holmes's unwavering gaze. "It's the magistrate's order, sir. The complaint was filed by a certain influential party who claims you have been meddling in affairs that threaten public order." Holmes arched a brow. "An influential party, you say? Perhaps one who has much to lose should the truth see the light?" Fenley's grip on the poker tightened, his voice low and menacing. "You mean Ramsay's accomplices, the ones who never faced justice?" The constable's jaw clenched. "I serve the law, not rumors." "Yet it appears you have served those who hide behind those rumors," Holmes replied sharply. "Care to explain the ledger we discovered, detailing shipments, payments, and names that include men of your own precinct?" Merrick's eyes darted nervously, and for a moment the veneer of authority cracked to reveal panic. "You have no proof?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Proof begins with truth, Constable. And truth in this house has been long suppressed." Fenley stepped forward, lowering the poker but not his stance. "You'll find, Merrick, that loyalty to family outweighs allegiance to corrupt orders." Suddenly, the library door swung wide and Lady Agatha entered, flanked by several villagers and a pair of mounted officers. The villagers' faces were grim but resolute. They had heard whispers in the village, tales of smuggling and betrayal, and had come to stand with the rightful heirs of Wiltham House. "Enough blood has been spilled in silence," Lady Agatha declared, her voice steady despite the weight of her lineage. "This house will no longer shelter deceit." Holmes turned to the officers. "Arrest Constable Merrick. His actions betray both law and conscience." Merrick's protests were futile as the officers moved to detain him. His eyes met Holmes's one final time, a mix of fury and despair. As Merrick was led away, the room exhaled collectively. Fenley lowered his poker, nodding gratefully to Holmes and Lady Agatha. Holmes then turned to me. "Watson, bring me the captain's journal once more." As I handed over the leather-bound volume, Holmes leafed through the pages until he found a final entry, one never read aloud. "If I perish, let this be known. The house is more than stone and timber. It is a vessel for truth, no matter how deeply buried. My hope lies in those who seek justice beyond fear." Holmes closed the journal gently. Captain Farrington's faith was not misplaced. The truth has been wrested from shadows. Lady Agatha wiped a tear from her cheek, her eyes reflecting a newfound strength. "I will restore the house and honor the legacy of those who protected it." As the dawn broke over the cliffs, casting a golden glow upon Wiltham House, Holmes and I stood upon the veranda, contemplating the journey that had led us here. The web of deceit was intricate, Holmes mused, woven by men motivated by greed, fear, and loyalty. Yet, as ever, logic and perseverance unravel even the tightest knots. I smiled, feeling a quiet pride in our triumph. "Do you think the house will finally sleep at midnight?" Holmes's gaze swept the horizon. "For now, Watson. But in our line of work, peace is but a fleeting visitor." With that, we turned our steps toward the rising sun, ready to face whatever mysteries awaited us next, leaving behind the house that had once woken at midnight, but would now, at last, rest in the light of truth. The gentle rays of morning had not yet fully conquered the lingering shadows when Holmes and I stood once again on the veranda of Wiltham House, the crisp sea air filling our lungs as the waves whispered secrets far below the cliffs. The house behind us, now bathed in early light, seemed less a fortress of mystery and more a testament to endurance, a place scarred by treachery but poised for renewal. Holmes lit his pipe, exhaling a slender plume of smoke that mingled with the salt breeze. "The affair at Wiltham has come to a close, Watson, yet as ever I find myself pondering the interplay of motive and circumstance that brought it to such a tangled state." I nodded. It was a web spun by greed and fear, but also by misplaced loyalty. Fenley's silence, the constable's corruption, Ramsay's vengeance, each a thread in the tapestry. Holmes smiled faintly. "Precisely. And it is a reminder that human nature is rarely simple. Men will weave deception not merely for gain, but to protect, to atone, or to hide wounds deeper than any ledger might reveal." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Agatha, accompanied by Mr. Fenley, whose resignation had been delayed until matters were secured. His gaunt face bore the weight of years and unspoken burdens, yet there was a quiet relief in his eyes. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Lady Agatha greeted us. "I have resolved to remain at Wiltham to see the estate restored and its name cleared. Fenley, too, has agreed to stay, at least until the new keepers arrive." Fenley inclined his head, voice low. "The house has been part of my life longer than I care to count. I owe it that much." Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. "Your loyalty was admirable, Fenley, though at times it threatened to blind you." "Perhaps," Fenley admitted, "but some secrets are harder to bear than others." Lady Agatha gestured toward the garden. "I believe the house will prosper now, with truth as its foundation." Holmes glanced toward the cliffs beyond. "Let us hope that the past remains at rest there, undisturbed by the tides of human folly." I felt the weight of the case lift as we walked slowly through the gardens, the last vestiges of night giving way to the promise of day. Later, seated in the familiar comfort of 221 B. Baker Street, I recorded the final notes of our adventure. Holmes reclined in his chair, pipe aglow, eyes distant but content. "Do you ever tire of these cases, Holmes?" I asked. He smiled wryly. "On the contrary, Watson, each is a new challenge, a puzzle that sharpens the mind and occasionally reveals the depths of the human soul." I paused, reflecting on the events that had unfolded, the deception, the courage, the shadows cast by those we thought we knew. Holmes continued, "Wiltham House was but one chapter. Many more await, and we must be ready. The game, as ever, is afoot." As the evening deepened and the gas lamps outside flickered to life, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The mystery of the house that woke at midnight had tested us, but in unraveling it, we reaffirmed a simple truth, that no darkness, no matter how thick, can withstand the steady light of reason. And so, with the city's murmur settling into night, Holmes and I prepared ourselves to answer the call of the next enigma, bound by friendship, curiosity, and the relentless pursuit of justice. The days following our return to London unfolded with the usual rhythm of life at 221 B. Baker Street, yet the echoes of Wiltham House lingered in my thoughts like a persistent refrain. Holmes, ever the enigma, seemed at once settled and restless, pacing the room with his characteristic energy between moments of intense focus in his chemical experiments or the perusal of incoming letters. One afternoon, as the rain pattered softly against the window panes in a grey, London fog seeped into the streets, a knock at the door heralded the arrival of a messenger boy bearing a small, unassuming parcel. Holmes took it with a raised brow and carefully peeled away the wrapping to reveal a leather-bound notebook, marked only with the initials A.R. Ave. "An unexpected gift," he murmured, flipping open the cover. The pages were filled with meticulous notes, sketches of landscapes and cryptic annotations. A personal journal, evidently belonging to Captain Ambrose Farringdon himself. I leaned closer, curiosity piqued. "Another piece of the puzzle, Holmes?" He nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, Watson. It appears the captain left behind more than just ciphers and secret ledgers. His thoughts, fears, and perhaps a key to understanding the full scope of his final days." As the evening deepened, Holmes and I settled by the fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows upon the walls. He began to read aloud excerpts from the journal, each passage revealing a man tormented by unseen threats and a desperate desire to protect his family and estate from forces both external and internal. In one entry, Ambrose wrote of strange sightings along the cliffs, figures moving in the mist, signals flashed between hidden coves, and a growing sense of being watched. Another detailed a clandestine meeting with a mysterious informant who warned of betrayal from within his closest circle. Holmes's keen eyes sparkled with renewed determination. This confirms my suspicions that the danger was not only from Ramsay and his cohorts, but from deeper within the fabric of the estate's guardians. I could not help but admire the captain's foresight and the burden he bore. "It is a tragic legacy," I mused. Holmes agreed. "Yet one that has now been laid bare, allowing us to close this chapter with a measure of justice." Our reflections were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, summoned by Holmes earlier in the day. The inspector, ever pragmatic and sometimes brusque, had brought news from Dorset, a report confirming the arrests of several individuals implicated in the smuggling operation, including officials within the local constabulary. "Good work, Holmes," Lestrade acknowledged, handing over official documents. "Your findings have sparked a full investigation, and the corrupt will face the consequences." Holmes inclined his head, eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. It is always heartening to see reason and evidence prevail. As night settled over London, I took a moment to gaze out into the fog-laden streets, contemplating the intricate dance of secrets and revelations we had witnessed. The case of the house that woke at midnight had tested our resolve and intellect, unveiling layers of human complexity beneath the veneer of superstition. Holmes, standing beside me, spoke softly. "Watson, cases such as these remind us that the shadows we chase are often cast by the very human hearts that beat behind them. It is our task to illuminate those shadows, to restore balance where chaos has taken root." I nodded, feeling the profound truth of his words resonate within me. "And so, the game continues." With that, we turned away from the window, ready to face whatever new mysteries awaited us in the winding alleys and fog-filled streets of London, bound by friendship, duty, and the unending pursuit of truth. The days that followed settled into a measured routine at Baker Street, but beneath the surface of normalcy, Holmes's mind remained keenly attuned to every whisper of intrigue that drifted across London's labyrinthine streets. It was during one such quiet evening, as the gas lamps flickered and cast trembling shadows upon the walls, that the familiar knock at the door heralded a new development, an envelope bearing the official seal of Scotland Yard. Holmes accepted it with a slight nod and broke the wax with deliberate care. His eyes scanned the contents swiftly, a flicker of interest deepening in their depths. "Watson," he said, folding the letter and pocketing it, "it appears our recent success has stirred old embers in unexpected quarters." I leaned forward. "What news from the yard?" "A case, ostensibly unrelated, but connected through a single thread. A letter found among the possessions of a recently apprehended forger. It references Wiltham House and hints at a conspiracy broader than mere smuggling or local corruption." Holmes rose and paced the room, the familiar cadence of his stride echoing the churn of thoughts within his mind. Our quarry, it seems, was but one node in a network, its roots twisting through London's underbelly and reaching to places we had not yet dared explore. I stood to join him by the window, gazing out at the rain-slick streets below. "Do you think this will lead us back to Wiltham?" "Perhaps not directly," he mused, "but certainly to those who benefited from the shadows it harbored. The game is never truly over, Watson." That night, as the city settled into slumber, Holmes returned to the study with renewed vigor, consulting his volumes and cross-referencing the new intelligence. Together, we mapped the connections: smuggling routes, forged documents, corrupt officials, all converging toward a mysterious figure known only as the broker. The puzzle deepened, and with it, the stakes. Weeks later, our investigation led us to the docks, where fog mingled with the salt and smoke of the Thames. Under the cloak of darkness, we observed clandestine meetings, whispered transactions, and shadowy figures moving with practiced caution. It was there, amidst the labyrinth of warehouses and piers, that Holmes's sharp eyes caught sight of a familiar face. Fenley, the faithful groundskeeper, but here in a different guise, exchanging parchments with a man whose identity we could not yet discern. Holmes whispered, "Fenley, the silent guardian, or something more?" We watched as Fenley slipped away, vanishing into the mist. The threads of loyalty and betrayal wove ever tighter. Days turned into nights of careful surveillance and delicate maneuvering until we orchestrated a raid that unveiled the broker, a man of influence who had orchestrated the smuggling and maintained control through fear and bribery. As we stood amidst the wreckage of his empire, Holmes reflected, "Truth is a lantern that can only illuminate so far into the darkness. Beyond that lies the unknown, waiting to be discovered." Returning to Baker Street, I felt the weight of our journey, a testament to the endless complexity of human nature and the ceaseless pursuit of justice. Holmes, ever restless, smiled with quiet resolve. "Onward, Watson. There will always be another mystery, another house that wakes at midnight." And so, as dawn broke over the city, we prepared once more to step into the shadows, armed with reason and unyielding resolve, ready to chase the light of truth wherever it may lead. The final days of the investigation unfolded with the quiet inevitability of a well-executed chess game. Holmes and I maneuvering carefully through the tangled web that the broker had spun across London and Dorset. Each step drew us closer to the heart of a conspiracy far greater than simple smuggling, a network entwined with forged documents, blackmail, and the covert manipulation of estates like Wiltham House. Holmes had spent countless hours poring over intercepted letters, financial records, and coded correspondences, his keen mind piecing together the mosaic of motives and machinations. At last, he called me to 221B, a rare glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "Watson, the time has come to unravel the final knot." In the flickering lamplight, Holmes laid out the facts with characteristic precision. Captain Ambrose Farringdon, while entangled in illicit dealings, was a man burdened by conscience and fear. His death was staged to mislead, not by accident, but by design. Ramsay, his erstwhile partner turned adversary, sought to seize control of the estate through intimidation and false hauntings. Yet he was but a pawn. Holmes paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The true architect was the broker, a shadowy figure who profited from the chaos. This individual employed Merrick, the corrupt constable, to stifle inquiry, manipulated Fenley's loyalty to silence, and orchestrated the spectral disturbances to coerce Lady Agatha into relinquishing Wiltham House. I listened intently, marveling at Holmes's ability to perceive the invisible threads linking disparate players. "However," Holmes continued, "our misdirection has turned upon its maker. The broker underestimated the captain's foresight and our resolve." Holmes then produced the final piece, a coded ledger discovered in a hidden compartment within the broker's own residence. It detailed payments, blackmail, correspondences, and plans to destabilize multiple estates under threat of scandal and ruin. With this evidence, Holmes had orchestrated a sting with Lestrade's cooperation. The broker was apprehended in a daring operation mere hours ago. Lady Agatha, summoned to London, listened with a mixture of disbelief and relief as the truth emerged, finally unburdening her name and the legacy of her late husband. As the case closed, Holmes turned to me, his voice softened. "Watson, it is the delicate balance of justice and mercy that defines us. While some may fall to their own designs, others deserve the chance to rebuild." The house that once awoke at midnight now stood silent, its secrets laid bare but no longer haunting its halls. For Lady Agatha, peace was at last within reach. We departed London not long after, the city's endless fog receding before the promise of spring. Holmes mused quietly. Every mystery solved begets new questions. The world is vast, Watson, and the shadows long. I smiled, knowing our partnership would endure, ever ready to illuminate the darkest corners with reason and resolve. And so ended the case of the house that woke at midnight, an intricate tale of deception and courage where the truth, steadfast as ever, prevailed.